We know your home appliances are essential, and if you need a new one, you need it fast. Many products are in short supply due to COVID, but we're member owners of a huge regional appliance warehouse right here in New England, so we can often get the appliances you need quickly and deliver them faster than our competition. If products are out of stock, our knowledgeable team will recommend the best plan for you. Plus, we have expert delivery and installation. You won't find that in a national chain. Did you know your local appliance retailer is the best place to buy your new KitchenAid suite? Click here to find the dealer closest to you.
Hi there, I'm Janelle Nanos, business reporter with the Boston Globe. Thank you so much for joining us today for a live event where we talk about sustainability in the kitchen. We've got a great group of panelists here to talk about all things sustainability. But before we get started, I wanted to introduce our sponsor today, Annie Meese, the Senior Associate Brand Manager for Whirlpool. Thanks, Annie.
Thank you, Janelle. Whirlpool Corporation is so grateful to be part of this event today. We manufacture Whirlpool, KitchenAid, Maytag, and JennAir appliances. We're grateful to be invited to the Sustainability in the Kitchen event because just last week we announced a corporate initiative to reach net zero emissions in all our plants and operations by 2030. In addition to that, we're working to achieve net zero waste to landfills across all our manufacturing facilities by 2022. Right now, over 70% of our manufacturing sites are currently zero waste to landfill. And when we all do our part in manufacturing products for the kitchen to people in the kitchen, we do our part to make a big difference. So thanks for including us on this event.
That's such great news. Thank you so much for being our host. At this point, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First up, we have May Lee, who is the founder of Food Waste Feast, an upcoming cookbook and online project sharing creative recipes, smart strategies, and chef tips to help people reduce their food waste. She's the author of the Double Awesome Chinese Food Cookbook and an award-winning cookbook, and it features local and sustainable ingredients, and the former co-owner of the May restaurant in Boston. She currently lives in North Carolina with her husband and 2 kids. May, thank you so much for joining us. As I was saying to her yesterday when we had a prep call, I've been following her on Instagram for a long time at Food Waste Feast, and meeting her in person felt like meeting a celebrity. So the other half of the Lee family that's joining us is Irene Lee. And she opened May in 2013 with her family and has spent the years since driving the industry forward in ethical sourcing and fair and transparent employment practices in the restaurant industry. She's a native of Boston. She's worked on farms, taught in prisons, and is a 6 times James Beard Foundation Rising Star Chef semifinalist. She has done a ton of work since COVID-19 started to support the industry, pivoting her business to serve hospital workers, hot meals, and groceries. She also co-founded Project Restore Us, which is delivering groceries to restaurant workers in and around the Boston area. And she's currently serving as program manager for Commonwealth Kitchen's Restaurant Resiliency Initiative, putting her experience to work in supporting people of color that are restaurant workers in the city of Boston, restaurant owners and workers in the city of Boston. And finally, Rich Shih is the co-author of Koji Alchemy, one of the leading culinary explorers of koji and miso in the United States. He is an in-demand food preservation consultant who helps chefs build their larders, leverage fermentation to decrease waste, and offers ideas with which to experiment. He holds public and private workshops to share fermentation knowledge, and runs a website called Our Cook Quest, which provides connections to welcome environments for cooks of all experiences levels to learn, share knowledge, and exchange ideas, which he's going to be doing with us today. So I'm excited about that. Thank you so much, Rich, for joining us as well. So I'm going to just start the conversation by asking each of you to maybe just start with a little bit of your, how you first began thinking about sustainability in the kitchen. Was it something that you were conscious of, or was it something that you just kind of realized was sustainability when sustainability suddenly became a thing that we're all talking about? May, why don't you start, since you're the food waste wonder here?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here along with my younger sister, Irene. So we started May food truck and restaurant with our brother, and it was really owning a restaurant and a food truck that got me thinking about food waste because we spent a lot of our money on ingredients and realized that if you're not using all of your ingredients, you are throwing that money into the trash. Or in our case, thankfully, it was the compost, but still, that is a waste of your raw materials. And I kind of brought that idea home with me when I realized that there's so much waste that goes on in households, restaurants, but in fact, over 40% of the food waste in America is generated by individuals in their homes. And that is cool to think that actually, while it's a terrible problem, it's a way that all of us can help address the problem of food waste, even on just a small scale.
Great. Rich, why don't you share a little bit about your own sort of path to sustainability?
I think it all started when I was very young as a child, because my mother is a really resourceful cook in terms of what she would use. Almost nothing would get wasted in terms of the value of every part of the animal or an ingredient or some leftovers that would become something else. It just came down to if I was to ever throw any food away, my mom would basically want to kill me. And I was always a voracious eater anyway. So anytime that I would eat I would eat everything on the plate. I mean, if we're talking about a fish, my mom would cook a whole fish. And if there was, bones left over or the head, it would go into a soup the next day, all these things that were, of value. And that was the thing, was you would not waste anything or, you would be in big trouble. And I think that's sort of the ethics behind a lot of stuff that I do that's been ingrained in me, to know that, there was a lot of effort that went into, catching this fish or raising this animal or growing these vegetables that, a lot of people go through. And then to think of it as something that you would just throw away or it makes me sad. And I think we're here to influence people to think more about exactly what they are, utilizing and throwing away and being thoughtful about what those repercussions are.
Irene, why don't you share your own path as well?
Yeah, well, those two answers really resonated with me. I think the anecdote that I'll share is when I started getting involved in farming, first in high school and then later in college, I learned about what vegetables look like before they get processed to go to the grocery store. And so asparagus grows really tall and scallions are actually super long and have all of this delicious green part that gets chopped off. And so I remember right before we opened the food truck, we were volunteering at the food project a couple times a week. And, we saw the scallions that were 4 feet tall and we realized, okay, they're going to cut off the top 3 feet of that green and just compost it. And so we took home a lot of scallions that year. But I think for me, just thinking that farmers put so much effort into raising animals and growing produce, and for us to not use all of it just seems really rude, I guess, on some level. And I think it's really fun to find uses for the things, the bits and bobs that we have. And so from a creativity standpoint, there's so much that you can push yourself to try if you're really trying to use everything up. And I think Rich is the master of that.
Great. Well, so I think, the last year in particular, we've really been forced to look at what we eat and sort of make every purchase has been a little bit more fraught, right? Where we had, we're making choices and going to the grocery store felt like it was taking a little bit of a risk at some point. And, I think because maybe we're not eating out as much, we're just kind of closer to our food source and thinking a lot about, how we source our food, where and how often we should go to the store. I think it's sort of shifted consumption habits, and for many people, I think sustainability has become maybe more top of mind. I mean, what are some things to consider when you're making purchases to help make the best use of the food you buy, to help it last longer, to help it sort of, how much should you be buying, things along those lines? What are some recommendations there?
May, you go.
So that's definitely a great question, especially over this past year. I've had, friends text me like, what do I do with all this asparagus? Or I bulk bought a 25-pound bag of flour. Help, what do I do with it?
Or
And
you
so-
bought like a
or-
2-gallon jug of mayonnaise.
Yes. Well, that was very important. I'm glad I had that. So I think that, first of all, people, now that they're a lot of times have been grocery shopping less often, means you have to pay a little bit more attention to how you're storing things. So thinking about the best way to wrap your vegetables so they stay good longer, or storing your potatoes separately from your onions, or figuring out how you can share bulk packaging with people. There are a lot of ways that we can kind of work to extend the life of things. And then also, once you've bought all these things and you realize that you have to cook them, it's figuring out a few recipes that work for you and the people that you're feeding, and making sure that you have good ways to use them up. So I always kind of have a stack of recipes in my head that I go through when I open the fridge and find that there's all these different things and I don't know what to do with them. I have a few go-tos. So I always make sure that I have rice. I always make sure that I have eggs. I always make sure that I have pasta. And it's so easy to rotate any vegetable in and out with those dishes. So for example, fried rice, you can have leftover rice and you can chop up and toss in pretty much any vegetable. You can toss in so many things in your fridge. You can make pantry pastas that toss in any sort of vegetable that you've got. You can make pickles with what you have. You can make scrambles and omelets. There are so many things that you don't have to make with a recipe in mind, or you might tend to use certain ingredients, but it turns out that you can swap in and out all sorts of things. And that's a nice thing to kind of have in your cooking repertoire to use up whatever you've got.
And May calls these hero recipes because they help you rescue food. And I think that is a really fun way to think about your pantry, that you have this arsenal that's always there, and then you can swap different stuff in and out. For me, one thing that has been admittedly a lot harder during the pandemic, but I like to do is I used to shop for groceries almost every other day. And so shopping less and more often actually made grocery shopping more fun for me. It didn't have to be like a big production where I would stubbornly try to, carry 10 bags of groceries up to my 3rd floor apartment. And so just kind of buying what I know I'm planning to eat in the next 1 or 2 days, that's something that's helped me a lot. And I think maybe has even saved me time in addition to money, because I just, scoot by the grocery store on my way home, and then I am in and out in a matter of minutes. So that's one thing that I really like to do. That's great.
So for me, I think sometimes thinking about the context of, how you're preparing food, because a lot of people feel like, with vegetables, you have to either refrigerate them or cook them right away, especially, greens or things of that nature. But one of the things that you can think about is that commonly you have, a jar of pickles, right? That is always hanging around. Like you have a jar of something that's pickled, right? Whether it be olives, pickles, something that you already have. So there's this wonderful liquid that's in there that's brine. And honestly, all you have to do is take the leftover brine that you have and put whatever vegetables you want. So if you have, you have some, say we were talking about green onions earlier, green onions, and you like, or just some shaved onions. Or like I have some roasted radishes that I had from last season that I had put on the grill and I didn't get around to eating them because I had roasted them all at the same time. So all I did was I just put them in this pickle brine and put them back in the refrigerator. The other thing you can think about also is that you can simply do a lacto-fermentation of vegetables as well, which is, basically adding 2% salt to whatever vegetable and water that you're putting together, and you allow that to ferment for a week. So it's in the same order of like making sour pickles or sauerkraut. So you can think about it in the sense of when people had to preserve food over the winter to eat it, in these sort of ancient ways, very simply, all you're doing is adding acidity and salt. Whether it be a short-term thing like a quick pickle brine that already has value, that you may not know to use or would otherwise throw away. It has a lot of flavor in it already, and all you have to do is, honestly, this makes really great quick cucumber pickles, or whatever root vegetables you have. Slice them up thin.
use the same brine? Just you can keep using the same brine. You don't have to worry about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a level of dilution that happens, obviously. So for the first change, it's usually not like all right, but you can just add by taste in terms of a little bit of salt, a little bit of vinegar from your pantry. These things that you already have readily available, maybe a little sugar, maybe a little maple syrup. So all these things that you just, what you should do to understand this process a little bit more about quick pickles is just taste your brine. And if you put these vegetables in and they start to dilute your brine, bring it back to a level that it tastes the same. I mean, we can talk about percentages of things, but a lot of this has to do with feel and understanding of food as you've gone through it. And you already understand what the pickle should taste like. So if you can balance back those flavors with things that are in your pantry, it's a very simple thing to do to be able to create quick pickles and also more long-term pickles with the pickling brine that you already have. The other thing to do is just, you know, if you have extra fruit, just bury it in some honey or in some sugar or in some maple syrup. I mean, it doesn't have to be as crazy as what I have here. I have some elderberries that I foraged that I put in some honey. Actually, back in 2017.
Oh my gosh.
So this is shelf stable. You know, it has built a level of acidity and a level of sugar such that you don't even have to refrigerate it. So you're not even wasting any energy. So you're talking about all the jars you have. This is a very simple process. And it can be different concentrations. You know, this is a honey my friend gave me years ago that has wintergreen berries with some honey. And as you can see, it's preserved. And there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, we have honey, we have honey, we have sugar, we have these things that just sit on our shelves that are ready and waiting for us. And if you have this excess fruit, all you have to do is jam it in there and stir it up a little bit.
That's great.
And it's preserved. So these are the things that you can think of with what you have.
So I think you're absolutely right. You know, I think preserving food, pickling food, all of that was, you know, generations ago, so much more common. I think we have so many more concerns right now about food safety. And are we going to somehow, you know, give ourselves serious indigestion or worse, like, you know, if we don't do it correctly? I mean, what are some things that you guys keep? Some of you mentioned some pantry staples, but what are some things you guys keep on hand to have, you know, within reach when it comes to, you know, just making sure you can extend the life of the food that you have, you know, that maybe is a little bit more volatile or might be in your fridge otherwise? Rich, you mentioned vinegar, honey, sugar, all things that are shelf stable, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just comes down to, you know, there's this sort of attitude about fermentation that, you know, it could potentially be unsafe. But if you think of the ways of how things have been preserved or anything that you already use that's preserved, it is not a problem at all. So we're talking about vinegar, right? This is something that is, you know, creates acidity through a processing of microbial behavior that ultimately gets it here. Yeah, basically it first, you know, it has a lot to do with fermentation to create alcohol, and alcohol in itself is a preservative. So you have alcohol in your home all the time. So one of the things you can do is, you know, if you have some fruit and a little bit of sugar and a live vinegar, you can just put them all together and create your own vinegar. You know, obviously you'll create some level of alcohol and then ultimately vinegar, but it's a matter of understanding that you add a level of acidity and a level of sugar or salt to create this environment such that the microbes that would harm you are not able to proliferate or even be part of the process. So it's a matter of, you know, a little bit of simple education on how these processes are done. But, you know, if you think about, you know, you leave vinegar out for an infinite amount of time or alcohol or any of these salty things, you know, you have often you purchase, you know, some miso, right? Or some gochujang, right? These are things that are shelf stable because of how much salt they have, but they have a lot of flavor because of the microbial process that it goes through to create nutrient rich, you know, concentrated pastes. So those are the types of things that I often think about, because you think about these things that are already in your pantry, already hanging out. that you currently dip into that you use. So like an extreme example would be, you know, let's talk about salt, let's talk about sugar. These are all things that are, you know, shelf stable because microbes can't live in them because of they don't have the water activity to be alive. So if you think about it in the context of sugar, salt, acidity, in the ways that you can concentrate them high enough such that you don't even have to worry about these issues.
Yeah, another great preserving thing or way to keep your food good longer is just your freezer. Pretty much everyone has one, and it doesn't have to just be, you know, pre-made freezer things that live in there. I have 2 large bags in my freezer, and one is my smoothie bag and one is my stock bag. So every fruit scrap goes into the smoothie bag, and I have 2 small children, so there's always, you know, little bits of cut apple or the rest of the watermelon that they didn't finish, or maybe a pear that's gone soft, and that goes into the smoothie bag. And then when I cook, I keep my garlic peels, I keep my onion ends, any, you know, carrots or celery that might be on the verge of going a little too soft for eating, that all goes into the stock bag. And then once they're full, we either make smoothies or I make stock. And it's also a great place for meat bones, chicken carcasses, anything that you can get lots of good stock flavor. There's great ways to just keep that basically indefinitely. And then you can make more delicious things with them in the future.
I will say May's tip, and I was telling her this yesterday, May's tip, so I have small children who never finish a bowl of cereal. I could never have them do it. It just, my daughter loves to eat cereal, but like wants 3 bowls, but never finishes the 3rd bowl. May's tip to actually like pour the cereal and the milk into the smoothie and like mix it in, and because it's all the same ingredients,
More fiber,
and
more good stuff.
More fiber, more good. I was mind blown. So if nothing else, that is, and you can do that for you too. You know, your Cheerios can also make that work. You know, you guys have been talking a lot about things to have on hand. You know, some of the other things that I think people feel like they need, or they don't know that how they can do it. You know, some of it requires having other stuff around too. So tools, appliances, items that you keep around the house to help create a more sustainable kitchen. What are some things that you have found really kind of help you get to that next level in terms of just being able to make those, you know, you can do plastic bags in the freezer, that's easy enough, but what are some other tools or things you guys keep on hand?
Well, I can share a few of the things that I've slowly phased into my kitchen. I think once you start thinking about how bad single-use plastic is for the environment, and how so much of it cannot be recycled, what you were mentioning before is there are a lot of things you can use that will just cut out those single-use items. So for example, I love Beeswax Wraps. These just kind of take the place of plastic wrap, and they seal on top of you know, bowls and anything you want to just preserve, put in the fridge, and they're breathable, so they actually let your food stay good longer. And you can also make these yourself if you feel like it, but I have found that mine never work as well as the ones I buy. And also these are kind of silicone covers you can use to put over a cut onion in the fridge instead of plastic wrap, or you can, you know, cover a jar or a bowl that needs covered. I also really like silicone bags for both, you know, my smoothie and my stock bags, but also instead of sending your kid to school with a sandwich in a plastic bag, just send one of these and make them bring it home. I also reuse so many plastic bags, and I have them sitting all around the kitchen to dry, and they kind of stack up, but you know, you don't have to.
What's your hack on reusing plastic bags? Because I can never, I try and get them like dry and clean, and
So I put in dish soap and hot water, and I shake them so they get, you know, all in the corner. And then I turn them upside down, and I hang them on, you know, another tool in the dish rack to dry. And then I kind of keep recycling them until they have no life left. So at least if I have a single-use plastic item in my house, I try to make it multi-use.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Great. You know, one other aspect of this, you know, we're thinking a lot about food and sustainability in our kitchens, and you know, how we can make decisions about you know, purchasing, but some things also have kind of a second life to them, and you were talking a little bit about that earlier, you know, in terms of I'm thinking of course of everyone kind of growing scallions during the pandemic, but what are some other ways in which, you know, certain items you think it's a food scrap, but there's really more to it there, right?
Definitely. There are a lot of different scraps that you can regrow. And, you know, speaking of scallions, I have several stages of scallion regrowth that I keep on my windowsill, and they're just getting larger and larger. And this is a great use for all your jars. I like to hold on to jars because they're so useful for everything. And there are a lot of, lettuce and bok choy. I have the most success with scallions for sure, but basically you just, cut off the end of a celery, you pop it in water. Irene has regrown tons of vegetables and plants and flowers, and you wait for them to sprout roots. I've regrown mint and basil, and then you just, if you have a pot or a place to regrow it and let it hang out, then there are lots of ways to regrow things. For me, I have a lot of trouble with ones that tend to go bad more quickly, but the thing about scallions is that they just keep on giving, and you get another second round of scallions. And another thing is just to keep in mind when you're saving more food, you are also saving a lot of money. The average estimate for how much people waste in terms of food is, I think it's $120 a month for a family of 4. So, you're like going to the supermarket and you get 4 bags of groceries and you just leave one by the side of the road. And you think about how much money is generally part of a family's grocery budget. If you can stop throwing out the food that you have spent your money on, then it's so satisfying. And it's also just so much better for the environment. Food scraps in particular, they release, if you're concerned about, greenhouse gas emissions, food scraps, when they go into landfill and there's no oxygen for them, then they release a lot of methane. And that is much more powerful in a very bad way compared to carbon dioxide. So if you can compost, if there's a way that you can deal with those food scraps in a way that is actually regenerative, like putting it back into the soil, then that is a huge thing for the planet.
That's a very good point. Absolutely. I'm going through some questions here as people brought some things up. I want to make sure we're addressing.
Can I just quickly talk about this? Because
yes, of course. Yeah.
This actually brings me back several years to hanging out at May, doing some projects. So they always, during squash season, get a glut of like all sorts of wonderful squash from the farmers, and they're always buried in squash seeds. So one of the things that one of their cooks at the time, Peter, had challenged me with was, can you make a squash seed tahini? So one of the things that people often do is they'll pull out the squash seeds, right? And they'll actually separate out, what you would call the guts or the innards. I don't do that at all. I just take all of it and roast it all together, put salt and some seasonings, and it's awesome. So once you roast that, you can grind it down or blend it down into a powder, and it becomes this awesome toasty powder. But the other thing you can do is add a little bit of oil and infuse it, and then it creates basically, sort of a nut buttery type spread that you can add as a flavor in a pesto or into a baked good or things of that nature. So think about the utilization of every part of your vegetable. The other thing that I learned from my friend Kim Wegendorp, who's out in Denmark, is that I've been talking about, basically doing some pickling of different parts of vegetables and fruits. And he said, well, have you tried lacto-fermenting muskmelon skins? And I was like, no, I had never tried that. So basically I took the skins of, take the skins of a cantaloupe. It's like funky and weird. But if you treat it like you would sauerkraut, with lacto-fermentation, add 2% salt, it becomes this amazing flavor that I never encountered before, that, is worth exploring. So, there are these things where, there are these parts of the plant or vegetable or fruit that you don't really or think about to use, but when you try them in a specific context, it does work, and then you're able to use it in another way. And these are the types of things that I think that are important in terms of, once you start investigating these ideas and sharing them, then people are like, start to think about it in that way, and think about, well, what could I try? What could I do? What flavors can I make? And then you have this sort of exchange that happens that is by default the way of thinking. And then more people start thinking that way. And then it just sort of becomes natural to use every part. And then you don't even have to think about it as food waste. It's just food, right? That's the whole thing, is that you're bringing this back into the context of, and this is nothing new. I mean, this is something that has been part of our like culture heritage since the beginning. Like we've always, like before fairly recently in the, you know, industrial revolution and capitalism, you know, people have been isolated in terms of their understanding of food. But if you sort of just look back, you know, grandparents for me, great grandparents for others, it's like it was natural to use everything. It was natural to ferment things, and they had things in their basement all over the place that, you know, they would just bring up and show you, and you taste it and you're just like, wow, like what was that flavor? I need to have that. And it comes down to the fact that these microbes have been nurturing us for years, and we need to be more cognizant of that. And that's what this is all about.
Well, and I mean, it also ties in a little bit with the trends you're seeing about gut health and introducing more microbes to our diets and just kind of having more diversity in our food, because so many things are so processed that, you know, you're sort of taking a lot of the nutrients out of it. So I think you're right. And I think that whole, we're kind of going back, you know, going back in time is hopefully making us not just better eaters, but, you know, better digesters too. So
Absolutely.
Irene, I want to let you jump in too.
Yeah, I just wanted to note, sorry, I've been monopolizing the Q&A while you guys
doing an excellent job. I love it. Thank you for there's been so many great questions. So
I'm a compulsive multitasker, but I did want to just share that Gail mentioned that they have been making watermelon pickles, only to find out that her husband's grandmother used to make them. So there's a lot of, I think, going back to Depression era and eras even before that, that people are kind of rediscovering, especially as we're, you know, stuck in our houses during this time.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Yeah, and I also just want to mention, if you are a particularly lazy cook like me, then just don't peel things. It's so much easier not to peel them, and then you don't waste the peels. There's, as you're saying, lots of fiber and nutrients in there, and then it just makes things easier if you're not spending an extra 20 minutes peeling all your root vegetables.
I think that makes a great point, May. Like, I think a lot of the things that we've sort of, you know, conditioned ourselves to do in terms of food prep, you know, the peeling, the chopping, a lot of that stuff that we're kind of tossing, hopefully in the compost bin or the, you know, in the trash, is edible. And, you know, I think, again, going back to your Instagram feed, like you were putting strawberry tops in your smoothies the other day. And I was like, really? That's a thing I could do? I just don't know. But there was a question too about, you know, carrot greens and celery greens, like all the things we sort of have come to condition ourselves. Where and how do you use some of those bits and bobs, to use Irene's phrasing? You know, how do you incorporate those things into some recipes?
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many vegetables that people just, you know, discard their beet greens, but you are getting 2 vegetables for the price of 1. You should use those. And so I kind of treat most tops, squash, sweet potato greens, you don't see so much, but turnip greens, radish greens, beet greens, either like a hearty green like kale or chard. You know, you can slice them up and put them in a salad. You can saute them like you do spinach. If you don't particularly like the taste of them, then you can also chop them up and put them into a pesto. So carrot top pesto, chimichurri, salsa verde, any kind of range of those green sauces. I will throw anything green and leafy into those. You know, if I have arugula or spinach that is getting old, I will toss that into a green sauce. At the very basics, you know, just olive oil, salt, maybe a clove of garlic, some vinegar or lemon juice. And then if you want to, you can throw in any nut. So, you know, pesto is traditionally basil and pine nuts, but those are both very expensive items that I don't usually have around, but I've usually got whatever, arugula and walnuts. You can put in anything you want. You can put in Parmesan cheese. You cannot. It's totally up to you. And that's what's so nice. It's really flexible for any kind of special diet, but also it's just use what you have. You can swap in and out something. And those green sauces also then make so many other things more delicious. So you can make a green sauce and then stir it into rice. You can stir it into pasta. You can stir it into an omelet or a frittata. You can drizzle it on top of your soup. All of a sudden you've used something up and you put it in your fridge, and then that then makes more things more delicious. So it's kind of this nice cycle that keeps going around. If you've managed to save something, then it can improve future meals too.
That's great.
I gave the exact answer in the Q&A. So I guess, May, you and I have spent a little time together. I also just wanted to add that, you know, like the botany behind how different vegetables have come to exist can kind of give you some clues about how you can use things. So carrots are pretty closely related to Italian parsley. And so I always think anywhere I would use a lot of Italian parsley, I could use carrot tops instead. So that's where, you know, the chimichurri idea becomes really interesting. Beets and Swiss chard are the same species. They're just different cultivars. And so you really are just growing Swiss chard on top of your beets. And so using that means you don't have to buy the Swiss chard. And then same thing with brassicas. So like, broccoli, for example, the actual plant of broccoli has tons of leaves, but we just cut off the very, very tippy top of it and we eat the flowers. But those broccoli leaves are, you know, essentially very, very similar, if not identical to kale and collard greens. So especially if you're getting stuff from the farmer's market and it has all this extra roughage on it, thinking about, or, you know, even just Googling like the sort of botanical origins of stuff, I think is really fun and a cool way to experiment with new things.
Totally. I saw broccoli leaves at the farmer's market recently and was like, why don't you see these more? They're so good. Why are we spending money on kale when you have broccoli leaves that could come with your broccoli?
So it's such
I mean, like one of my favorite things to lacto ferment like Chard is cauliflower leaves and the cauliflower stems, because especially when they're in season, they have this level of sugar more than the florets themselves, and it makes it absolutely delicious.
Great. One other, you know, we're talking a lot about the food itself, but are there things that you guys do in your prep, in your kitchen, in terms of like, you know, just sort of having, you know, being a smarter, more sustainable cook in general? I'm thinking about, like, you know, they often say like, have your freezer be full because it's more efficient that way. Or like there was a couple of questions about whether people compost versus using the dishwasher disposal to, you know, put food scraps down there. You know, just in terms of practice, are there things that you know, or maybe using your pasta water to, you know, in another way so that you're reusing some of the items again and again? I mean, are there things that you do when you're prepping food that are also sort of thinking with sustainability in mind?
Yeah, I think, you know, for example, the pasta water is a great idea. Is you can cook your green vegetables with the end of your pasta. So that's just so easy and faster to just toss something in at the end, and then it all finishes at the same time. And you just have to think about, you know, is this a long cooking vegetable? Broccoli would go in sooner, spinach you just toss in right at the end to wilt. When I'm prepping, I have my stock bag stuff. So most things go into the stock bag. If I've got a lot of broccoli peels or something that might make a stock taste bitter, then that goes into my compost pile. So definitely figuring out what goes where and what you like to have in your stock is good, and kind of just developing a system so you know that nothing is going into your trash, and that's useful to have. And yeah, I think your great point about your freezer will work more efficiently if it's full. So that's probably why I continue to buy things from my freezer even if I don't need them. But it's really satisfying to have a full freezer of things. And then one of the things I just did is I had a huge container of peeled garlic, and I had no use for it. It was starting to get old, and I blended the whole thing with some oil and put it in a flat plastic bag to freeze. And if you freeze things flat, then you can stack them and they take up a lot less room. But now I have this frozen garlic and oil, and I just break off a piece anytime I want to cook, and then I don't have to chop garlic, and it's already there. And so there are all these useful ways to make your life easier in the future if you put in a little work to just preserve something before.
So how much, I mean, I guess one of the things that it can sort of feel like this is a lot of extra work, you know, oh, I have to be prepping a meal, but I also have to be pickling things, and I have to be saving this stuff. I mean, how much of this do you feel like is, you know, just kind of incorporated to meal prep and other things? Like I assume it's somewhat habit forming at this point, but, you know, how do you ingratiate those things into your overall, you know, preparation cycle?
I mean, that's a great question. It definitely can be a range of things. You can cook and prepare all the different little individual bits in different ways, or you just get used to eating them. For peels, for example, I like to put in a little bit of effort and then make my life easier in the future. So if I cook a big pot of whole grains, for example, then I have them in the fridge through the week, and I can put together, a 5-minute lunch that's so quick because I've already put in the time before. And then I know that I can use those grains in soups, stews, salads, all kinds of different meals. I can turn it into fried rice. And for me, a lot of food waste and using things up is just rethinking what you might be used to putting in certain dishes, where you think, okay, fried rice has to be made with white rice because that's the way I've always had it and I've always made it. But just for lunch yesterday, I had fried rice with farro, and it was delicious because I had it already. And if you get used to just switching out whole grains for each other, different noodles for each other, different root vegetables for each other, then you don't have to make a new thing or prep a new thing every time, but you just switch out the collards for the lettuce, or the arugula for the parsley, or the carrots for the beets, or whatever it is. And thinking about things in categories helps me a lot, because then it's easy to swap things out and make my life easier by just having one item that you go used multiple ways, instead of having multiple items that all need their own prep and all need their own dishes.
That's great.
Yeah, and I think in the context of understanding, how to utilize your food scraps, or like whatever food you have, is important. But like the things I have been mentioning in terms of for fermentation and preservation are really simple. So if we're talking about, say you're juicing some lemons, right? And there's this idea that you throw away the rest of it, right? You throw away the peels and whatever's left of the flesh. But if you think about it in the context of preserved lemons, it's just a matter of, okay, well, I just pack it in a jar with some salt, and then you're already there. And the other thing is just to think about, if I have all these say scallion tops, or like scraps of something that I've been cutting up in terms of onions, you can actually just put that into vinegar, and then you have an infused vinegar. So I think it's the attitude of, hey, if I'm already working on something, say I'm cutting up, like we were talking about, like we're cutting up this cauliflower because we want to roast the florets, but we have all these extra parts of the cauliflower that people don't necessarily want to eat in that way, where you've roasted it in the oven or put it on the grill. You can just slice it really finely, add 2% salt, and break it up, pack it in a jar, and let it lacto ferment like a sauerkraut. So these are the things that you think about that are very simple to do. I mean, even with May's talking about using her all of the parts of her fruit. The other thing you can do is what we talked about, is you can just put some of that fruit in some sugar, pack it in some honey, and now you have this awesome fermented honey that has all of these fruit flavors in it. So it's the context of just thinking about, what are you using? You're doing this work in the beginning anyway. So if you're cutting up vegetables, you're cutting up fruit, you're doing that already. So what's another, you double up your buy on it, and then you make these ferments that can be complements to the dish ultimately to be used. And if we're talking about, like, you're cutting up cucumbers for a salad, there's not much more effort to like put it in the brine of like these pickles that you already have, that you would have all poured down the drain. So these are the things that you think about, and especially as a cook, to be efficient. Because if you're cooking for a bunch of people, like your family, like you want to be able to cascade these sort of ingredients that you're already building that continue to feed the rest of the meals. And it becomes less work for you ultimately, because when you preserve and ferment food and create like more nutritionally dense, like things that you eat, then they become more delicious by default as well as nutritious. So then you're feeding this like sort of, I guess, regenerative cycle of how you eat, instead of saying, oh, I need this one thing, I have to go to the store and buy it. That means I have to get in the car, I have to go use all these resources, when all you had to do was stick that cucumber in a little bit of salt and water and wait for a couple of weeks for it to become a delicious pickle. So how much work is that? That's very little work for the ultimate deliciousness, and how much you save on your own work, as well as the environment and all these other repercussions that come along.
Yeah.
And I would just add as a last thing to do and being more efficient is if you're already cooking something in your oven, you've already got it on, use the other levels and stick something else in. And especially if you're, roasting a vegetable, what else in your fridge can you roast? You've already got your cutting board and your knife out. You're going to have to clean them anyway. You've already got your oven on, stick something else in there, and then it's ready for, instant side dish or put on top of a salad, add to another cooked dish. It's already ready. So it's much more likely to be eaten if it's already prepped and cooked than if it's, in its whole form in the fridge, and then you kind of look at it and then ignore it for another 2 weeks, which
and like tagging onto that, my favorite thing to do is when the oven goes off, you have this residual heat that you can use. So if you have, some fruit scraps, you can lay them on a Silpat or, a nonstick tray and basically just sticking them in there with maybe a little bit of salt. And then ultimately you have, this, a different, sort of salt ingredient that you could have. So you can use it as sort of a dehydrator at the end of the day, or you have like these parsley stems, right? Then you can make a parsley salt that you don't have to buy, or just parsley powder. So you just dehydrate using the remaining heat from your oven, and you just leverage that, and you don't have to go out and buy a dehydrator to do that.
I love that. I think one thing that's worth adding to this is like the gratification of making something yourself instead of going out and buying it is real, at least to me. And I think probably to everyone on this call, because we're here talking about it. But I definitely get that it feels like it can be a lot of extra work. But I think that, I don't know, especially during the pandemic, I feel like a lot of people who were not into home cooking or did not feel empowered in the kitchen sort of used it as an opportunity to learn about sourdough or learn about growing scallions in glass jars. And so I think anything that kind of builds on your repertoire of being in the kitchen is like just kind of a life skill. And I don't know, I have so many friends who like text me asking like, is this still good? Or like, what should I do with this ingredient? And I love answering those questions, but I also want people to feel like when they're in the kitchen, like they have what it takes. They don't have to use a recipe. They don't have to watch a video necessarily. And I think making use of all this stuff is a great way to kind of get your feet wet. Because like, if you mess it up, you can throw it out. You were going to throw it out anyway. So like, don't worry about it. Or, if it doesn't taste great, you can just eat it and then the evidence is gone. Nobody has to know. So I feel like I always just want to encourage like the experimentation towards feeling more empowered about what you cook at home.
Totally.
To the flip side of that, I think there's a lot of us that are ready to go back out, right? That now we might be vaccinated, we're going to restaurants again, we're really excited to support those restaurants. Obviously, that's a big part of this. How do you extend those same sustainability, passions that you've now developed in your kitchen or hopefully are developing to your experience dining out? And, what questions should you be asking? What sorts of, measures should you be taking? Even, after, you bring home your leftovers, what are some ways to continue the cycle a little bit just beyond your own kitchen, maybe?
Well, a couple of things I'll share. I always order too much food at a restaurant. And so when my spouse and I are like looking at each other across the table, like, what have we done? We're always thinking about like, okay, what's going to reheat well and what's not. And so we're going to prioritize what we eat here by what we can actually reconstitute into something else, like a fried rice the next day, or like if there's a salad and we know, we're not going to eat that tomorrow, then we try to eat that right away. I think in terms of asking restaurants and businesses to be accountable to sustainability, one thing in terms of local sourcing that I always recommend is if you see that a restaurant has a farm listed on its menu, the person who can tell you if they really buy from that farm is the farmer. So if you see them at the farmer's market, you can always go up to them and say, hey, I saw that you provide tomatoes to so-and-so's restaurant. And they will let you know if that restaurant is lying to you or not. And maybe if the restaurant is like really behind on its bills to that farmer, they could let you know that too. So I think that's always really valuable. When I first started working in the restaurant industry, I was horrified by the lack of compost and even more so by the utter lack of recycling. Like there's so many restaurants that charge hundreds of dollars a head that do not even recycle their cardboard or their glass. And it's just wild. So if you're curious about a restaurant's waste practices and you don't want to ask them because you don't trust them or because it's awkward, you can always go to the restaurant in the morning or like walk through the alleyway and look at what kind of waste receptacles they have back there. And if there's no compost bin, they are probably not composting. We got a lot of questions about compost in the Q&A too, but I do think restaurants need to be held accountable for this stuff. A lot of restaurant owners find it pretty easy to lie to customers. And so we should be holding them accountable.
Great point. Yeah, you know, who doesn't want to hang out in an alley and check out dumpsters? But when you're committed, you're committed, and that's what it means. That's right. You know, I do want to bring up composting. There were a lot of questions, and you know, there is a state law that also says restaurants have to compost in Massachusetts. So that is a good thing. I think those numbers are, you know, we're seeing more of that stuff. But if you are experimenting with at-home composting, what are some first things you need to know? What are some tips and tricks there? What are things that should not go in the compost? Or you know, can you help sort out a lot of the questions that have come into that effect?
Well, I would say a somewhat failed at-home composter. So I now pay for a service, which is awesome. They're called Compost Now, but they're only in the Southeast. I live in North Carolina right now. But I put all my scraps in a bucket and they can pick them up. But there are a few things that I can just say anyway. If you're worried about the smell, you can always stash your food scraps in the freezer until you can put them in your at-home composter or give them to someone else. Or there's also an app called Share Waste, and you can often find people who have extra space in their compost bin, or they have pigs to feed, or they have whatever it is, they've got room to accept your food scraps. So that's something that can work if you don't compost. That's probably all I should say, because I'm going to work on my own compost pile right now. Right now, it's best for me to outsource that.
Yeah, there were also a couple questions about like bins or buckets that you recommend and items that you can or should not put in compost. And I think the answer to all of those things is just, it depends. Whatever bucket or bin works best for you and is easiest for you to use is probably what's best. I do like storing compost in the fridge in the event that I cannot empty it in time and I don't want my kitchen to smell. And then different compost companies will accept different kinds of waste. So for example, if you're composting in the backyard, you probably don't want to put bones or meat in there. But if you are using an industrial composter, putting in meat and dairy and things like that tends to be okay. So we do always recommend like checking with whoever your provider is. And short of that, the internet. Because that's where we get most of our answers about things.
To that end, I mean, what are some resources that you guys recommend people check out in terms of, you know, the internet, but also your own books or things that are, you know, many of you have books, but, you know, the idea that that there are, you know, if there are a couple cookbooks or things that you think people should really look at and have on hand to help them through this journey, what are some things you recommend?
Well, I know someone who wrote this really incredible book called Koji Alchemy, and it is all about the magic of koji, and you know, a lot of it is about fermentation too. Koji really is magic, you guys. So if you haven't heard of it or you haven't looked into the book at all, there's someone here who can probably tell you a little bit more about it. There you go. Thank you, Rich. Just so you guys know, Rich is like a celebrity among chefs and restaurant owners. Like he flies all across the country, advising people on how to set up fermentation and koji setups. He's a celeb. Once I went to a restaurant in Dallas and they found out that I knew Rich, and then I had like the most magical experience of all time. It was crazy. So I know a guy. So definitely encourage you to check out that book.
That's great. Rich, why
I
don't
also
you?
know, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I also know someone who is a very wonderful writer and very non-judgmental about people's food waste. And that is my beloved sister, and her website is foodwastefeast.com. So recommend that too, of course.
I can't be judgmental because I'm also terrible about letting things just really go bad in my fridge. So that means I had to figure out to rescue them. So I am happy to help other people do the same. And I kind of thought about our website as there are so many recipes out there that are written very specifically. And I did that with our first cookbook, Double Awesome Chinese Food. And, I love cookbooks, but they're all written in a way that unfortunately kind of encourages food waste. It's like 1 tablespoon of parsley, but you could put 6 tablespoons of parsley if you wanted to, and if you like parsley. So really thinking more broadly about how recipes can be flexible and sort of building your comfort and confidence in the kitchen so you make it taste the way that you want to by whatever it is, adding more parsley or switching one ingredient for another ingredient, then you can really reduce the amount of ingredients that go to waste if you just get more comfortable with your cooking, and also just taking advantage of your freezer, which almost everybody's got, or whatever it is, the glass jars and making pickles is getting comfortable with things, and then you'll be so much more empowered to save more food and keep it from going into the trash.
That's great.
Yeah, for me, in terms of inspiration for fermentation, I mean, Sandor Katz is a big one. His most recent, compendium, that's been out there for years is The Art of Fermentation. It has pretty much every fairly well-known fermentation process, as well as some that people don't know about. It's like this sort of like wide and deep dive into what's possible, and it's more about methodology than recipes, and it's really helpful. My friend Kirsten Shockey has a series of books out on fermentation, as in all sorts, whether it be food or alcohol into vinegar and these sorts of things. Like, definitely check out her books. I mean, there's a whole community that's on social media that's sharing, and I think it's just up to people to just look up, just type in Google a specific method that you want to try, like vinegar, and you'll find like a whole compendium of possibilities. And it all comes down to just trying one thing. If you really like a vinegar, or you really like a pickle, like, figure out how it's made. Even if it is just a quick pickle, and you use the vinegar in your house, you use the salt and sugar, you use these things that you like, and you make something that is wonderful, because these are all constituents of things that you enjoy eating. And that's where you start, before you have this adventure of trying something that's super funky, that's like in the back room of some like weird place. You start with what you really enjoy and what you've grown up with, what your parents fed you when you were a kid. And that's where it grows from. Because, in every context of, being an American, everybody's tried ketchup, right? But nobody really makes the original ketchup, which is, basically fish sauce. So these are all the things that we talk about, that we start with, these starting points of where the origins of these foods were, and how we've lost the context of what they are. Because if we told people that vinegar was fermented with this weird, like, gooey thing on the top of the liquid that makes it sour, like, nobody would like that. But everybody drinks ketchup, and that's the key constituent of ketchup. So why be afraid of it when it's absolutely delicious? And once you understand the process, it's even more beautiful.
Great. Well, that's a great place, I think, for us to wrap up this discussion. Thank you, all three of you, for really fun chat, and for so many good ideas. There's a couple questions in the Q&A about trying to get some of this. We'll try and figure out a way to get it to all the attendees, just some of the answers and feedback here. But I want to make sure that we get a chance for Annie to close out. Again, thank you for hosting this event, Annie, but I want to bring you back on at this moment.
Thank you, Janelle. I appreciate the opportunity to sponsor sustainability in the kitchen. I learned a few game changers, and I'm also an avid Ziploc bag washer outer. So it was a really good discussion, and sustainability is really important to Whirlpool Corporation. So if anyone's interested in how we do that, welcome to look at our website, whirlpoolcorp.com, and look at what matters to us. But I think the tips learned today and fermentation is really an interesting topic to me. I'd love to dig into some of those books that you shared, Irene. And thank you all for letting us have this opportunity.
Thanks so much to everyone who's watching at home and for everyone here coming together. This has been a really fun and engaging chat. So we'll have to do it again sometime soon. Thanks.
This is so fun. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.